Knowing certain pawn structures is a key thing if you want to improve your chess in the long run. And today we're going to have a look at a very typical pawn structure, which is the hanging pawns. The hanging pawns are a structure where one side has this C and D pawn kind of hanging in the air without being connected to the king side and without being connected to the queen side, so thus the hanging pawns. In general, the hanging pawns can be a strength in middle games as they control a lot of central squares, but the more pieces are traded, the weaker the pawns become and the less important the dynamic options become. So in endgame it's often a weakness, in the middle game it can often be a strength. And we will see this as a sample game of the strength of these pawns and some plans connected to playing with the hanging pawns. One last note, the hanging pawns often arise from an isolated pawn position. Imagine the d4 pawn being isolated and then a knight trading on c3, making the isolated pawn no longer isolated, but protected by the c3 pawn, but creating this typical pawn island, which are called the hanging pawns. So let's see how this game continued. White first played c4, which is a good move because now the pawns are in their favorite formation next to each other, thus controlling all the central squares and not leaving any chance to be blocked. Meanwhile, if this pawn would stay on c3 forever, it might be easier, way easier for black to set up a blockade. Just imagine black would get control of this square with something like a6, b5. This is a scenario where the hanging pawns are usually not that ideal. So when you can, you put the pawn on c4 and d4. Always make sure they are not hanging. So black played rook e8, which is a bit passive. White played queen to b2, having several ideas, putting the queen to this diagonal, which might be useful, but maybe also kind of going here, finding some targets. Black plays knight to d7, and this is another key moment. Of course, we do not want to let him trade here. First, this would cost us the pair of bishops, but also note that if we would allow this trade, we would end up with the worst pawn structure, as this pawn is now isolated, this pawn is now isolated, which is basically caused by the hanging pawns. If one is going, the other pawn is isolated. So never allow this. This is usually something you're not interested in, but instead white moved the bishop back, which is a good move. And now black has no direct way to attack the pawns further, and thus played the solid looking queen to e7, getting the queen out of the d file and just waiting and saying white cannot push the pawns as otherwise they might turn weak. White played rook fe1 first, opposing the queen with the rook, and after queen f8 white played a very typical plan, which I want to make you aware of. Maybe you already have some experience with hanging pawn positions and you can find the idea on your own. It's white to move. How should white proceed here? What's a typical plan for white? And we will continue with the solution. There is basically more than one solution, but I want to show the standard plan. There is another computerish solution, which is pushing c5 immediately, but it usually is not a standard idea. It just works here because there are some tactics, and after takes. This is all not possible because the black queen is boxed in and black needs to sacrifice an exchange, and white is winning here. But it's more complicated than this, and so I think in human terms it is difficult to play the c5 push, as black does not even have to take, for example, queen e7, bishop d6, queen here. it's not so clear, and if white would just trade a pawn, he would even be worse because he ends up with this isolated pawn. So when you push the pawns, you always need to have some clear plan in mind. Computers are showing the way, but this is very difficult and not a standard plan, like bishop c4, now trying to win some exchange, and black needs to hold. And after this, it's still not clear to a human why this is so excellent for white, but white is a lot better here. But I guess that's not a human idea. Instead, I think there are two human ideas, one of which is the standard idea, which I checked before, and the other one I've just seen spontaneously, which is queen to b4. Queen to b4 has the idea that this trade would be very beneficial because white captures towards the center, and maybe white can even fix the a7 pawn there, move the bishop away, and then go for the a7 pawn, which might look very tempting. But I think the downside of queen b4 is that black by no means has to trade. So maybe black will just go away with the queen, anticipating the threat of bishop d6, but still white might make some progress here. Maybe this is some progress. So it's not entirely clear to me if there's something wrong with this one, but it seems to be a decent idea. So try to improve the pawn structure. But the more general concept, and the one I was intending to show, is to play a4. And one of the key elements is, this is always the case, this pawn is also isolated whenever you have hanging pawns, because yeah, the d and the c pawn, they are just like split from the a pawn, because otherwise we would not have this definition of a hanging pawn structure. And so this pawn is a single pawn, and it might be a target. It is weak by nature because it's a single pawn, and so you very often just throw this pawn forward, trying to create a single pawn in your opponent's camp. So basically getting rid of your weakness, but making his pawn on b6 weak. So the plan is just to throw this pawn, trade, and then he has the weakness on b6 where you can try to play against. And that's a key motive you should know about those hanging pawn positions. It's not really possible to stop it, as this a5 move, it would stop it, but it would leave the pawn vulnerable anyway, because this pawn is now, yeah, backward pawn and needs the defense of the knight all the time, and this might be exploited later. So after this, white played this, black took the pawn, but now the c pawn is already a passer, and this can become very dangerous later. c5 is a good move, queen d8, bishop to c4, knight to b8, rerouting the knight, bishop d6, queen d7, and after queen e2, rook d8. Now white kind of lost track a bit, and I will not show the game, but instead I will show how white could finish the game strategically in a very nice fashion. So white has already gained this advantage of this passer and the bishop pair, and this looks all quite dangerous, and black kind of uses all his pieces to just tackle that, and black is a lot busy with the c pawn, the bishops, and so on. And often in chess, one weakness is not enough to break down the opponent's position. So whenever you see your opponent is really struggling with one thing and he uses all his pieces to deal with that, you should think about inducing a second weakness, because that will usually be too much, and he will not be able to defend against that, as yeah, the pieces they already have a job. They cannot deal with a second one. So the question now is, of course, where can white create a second weakness? And the answer is kind of in the center or on the king side, because there are no defenders present. And one way to do it, not the only way, of course, we're talking about some strategic concepts, and in contrast to tactics, there is not just one single solution. But I like h4. bishop c4, sorry. And after a4, just h4, trying to gain more space. Throwing back this bishop to h7 when the king would be back ranked again, and also the f7 pawn loses some defender. If he goes h5, the h5 pawn might be a target, or we might even use it to open files with g4 at some point. Of course, we would need to take care of that, but I think h5 is not in general something you are very happy about. So black could drop the bishop back, but now white could open the center, and we see black is not only dealing with the c pawn but also with the f7 pawn now and the threat against the queen. Meanwhile, this a pawn, it might run down the board a bit, but it's never really getting dangerous because yeah, it just has no support. And after queen f3, it's already very bad for black, as he cannot defend against all the threats. I think rook e7 might be an idea. The knight couldn't take, and after that f7 would drop. Bishop g6 would always be answered by h5, and rook d7, which seems like the natural try, runs into bishop c6, leading to a back-ranked mate on e8 after trades on c6. So what you should learn from this example is, what are the hanging pawns? What are their strengths? They are strong in the middle game when they are next to each other, controlling a lot of squares. They are weak in the end game when the opponent can attack them because they are loose. And you should be by now familiar with this plan of throwing the a pawn, trying to either distract the b pawn, making the c pawn a passer, or creating a weakness on b6 by trading and giving the single pawn, the isolated pawn, to the opponent. Another thing which we came across is, once your opponent has a big weakness on one side and is tied up to it, don't try to brutally break through on this side, but try to create a second weakness, which is a key strategic concept in general. So, hope you enjoyed the video, could learn something from it. If so, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.